It is official now. We're going to really start the event. Welcome to the virtual event from America's Black Holocaust Museum and Boswell Book Company. It is day 4,379 of Boswell being in business, and what a special day it is. Tonight's event is on Zoom webinar, which means you don't have a camera or speakers, but you can watch and listen to everything, and you can also ask questions through the chat function, which is underneath your virtual image. So please feel free to use that because we will be taking questions. And now I would like to introduce our very special partner, America's Black Holocaust Museum. We've done a number of events together, and they're always amazing, partly due to the help of Sydney Key, the Director of Operations, a fellow book lover. And may I introduce Sydney? Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for that generous introduction, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And it's always our pleasure to partner with Boswell on these great type of events. Just a little bit about America's Black Holocaust Museum. America's Black Holocaust Museum is a Milwaukee institution that is focused on sharing the history of African Americans in America and the Black Holocaust. We were founded by Dr. James Cameron, who is one of few known survivors of a lynching in American history. Our museum is poised to reopen very soon as we know more about the way forward with our new normal in the times that we're living. So that's always the question that I get, when are we gonna be fully reopened? So more information coming soon, but be sure to follow our social media pages for those updates. I will say less about that and more about the reason why you're all here this evening. We have this wonderful event tonight with our author, Martha Jones, and our discussion partner, Joanne Williams, joining us this evening to discuss Vanguard. And so really quickly, I'm going to introduce you all and then let you guys take it from here because you're the reason everyone is here and why we want to join tonight. So first, I'll introduce Martha S. Jones, is the Society of a Black Alumni Presidential Professor at Johns Hopkins University and the president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the oldest and largest association of women historians in the United States. She is also the author of Birthright Citizens and All Bound Up Together. So thank you, Martha, for joining us this evening. Also, our discussion and conversation partner, Joanne Williams, is most recently the host of Black Nouveau and is the producer of the forthcoming documentary titled The Exchange in White America, Kokana and King 50 Years Later, which tells the story of the 1966 exchange of Black and white high school students between Rufus King High School in Milwaukee and Kokana High School in the Fox River Valley. Thank you both for joining us this evening. You all are in for a treat, a discussion about how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all. So thank you for joining us this evening. I'm gonna mute and go off camera now, and you guys take it from here.
Well, thank you, Sydney. So now it's just Martha and me. Nobody else is out there, Martha. It's just the two of us. No, I think there are several more people out there. Thank you very much for coming and talking about your book. I really enjoyed reading your book. I learned about women that I knew nothing about before, and I think that's what's important. Let me start with the basic question that I always start with. Why did you write this book? And why was it you to write this book rather than some other historian?
Well, thanks so much, first of all, Joanne, for doing this with me this evening. It's really an honor to be with you. And I'm so grateful to America's Black Holocaust Museum and, of course, to Boswell Books for hosting us. The one answer to your question is that I was worried. It was now quite a few summers ago, a friend sent me well, nobody sends you a news clipping anymore, but he sent me a link to a news article. And he knew that I'd be interested because I had long been a historian of women, in particular, a historian of Black women's politics. And he knew that the article would get my attention. What did the article say? it was announcing that for August of 2020, which was understood to be the moment when we would mark 100 years since the 19th Amendment had been ratified, the Women's Suffrage Amendment had become part of the Constitution, that there was a monument plan for New York City's Central Park. And the details of the monument definitely caught my attention because there were only two figures who were planned to represent all of women's history. And those were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And I stepped in, as did many people, as New York City opened up a moment for public commentary to say that, you know, the history of women, the history of women's rights, the history of women's votes is far more than Stanton and Anthony, and that there was at least one more candidate, apt candidate for a monument in New York, and that was Sojourner Truth, the formerly enslaved woman from upstate New York who frankly entered the national women's rights scene before either Stanton or Anthony did, but somehow she was left off the monument. Now, the monument story has a somewhat happy ending, and it's there today in Central Park, and Truth is there with Stanton and Anthony representing that early history. But for me, the story wasn't over, because what I realized was that in the plan for that monument, we were in danger of coming into this centennial year and overlooking Black women altogether as plans were unfolding for commemorative events. And I'm not somebody who designs monuments. I admire people who do that work, but I am someone who writes books, and I am someone who for a long time had been writing Black women's political history. And so this was my chance, if you will, to intervene and to help to shape the conversations in an anniversary year. But it turns out to introduce this really important chapter in American political history, and that is the story of Black women.
When you started writing the book, did you ever ask other people, and did you ask yourself, why has this history not been told before?
Yeah. Like, put me in a room of young people, and I have been in many rooms, at least virtually, with young people in this last 6 months or so. And they say, more pointedly than yours was the polite version of the question. What they say to me is, why have you kept this history from us for so long? And I have to explain to them, you know, in part, I didn't learn this history in school either, right? In that sense, it was kept from me. It was kept from many of us for a very long time. I try and recruit them to become historians, and I tell them, you know, if there's a history that you need, then you've got to roll up your sleeves and do the research and write it. And this was a book that I needed, and I hope that other people would need too. But the real answer is that for a long time, historians in the United States deferred to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and their associates, who wrote a 6-volume tome called The History of Women's Suffrage that elided and overlooked and excluded Black women's political history from the story. So historians bear some important part of the blame, if you will, right, for why it took so long for us to fully surface this history.
Do you think one of the reasons it took so long is because the white historians who were writing the stories of what had happened didn't consider Black women as women, or in many cases, when we were still enslaved, as people?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's no question, but that anti-Black racism, white supremacy shapes the ways in which history is researched, the way in which the archives are created, then what is written, and certainly what is taught, whether it's in books like mine or it's in the textbooks that many of us were raised on. And at the same time, I think that, you know, Black women have always been writing their own history. And so there's another way to think about the story, is that much of the story that I tell was right there, right under our eyes. And I'm part of a community of Black women's historians who for generations have been doing that work. Part of my privilege in writing this book was to surface some of that work for a broader readership, so that we could bring those stories that are right there in the archive out into the light.
An interesting point I thought about the book was that you explained how Black women's participation in church politics taught them how to participate in the larger politics. And it all became sort of entangled. If you did well in your church, you could probably do well in the larger politics, or maybe not. Did you find that? I found it very interesting. Did you want people to understand the history of the church in America, as well as the history of politics with a big P in America?
You know, once you give up on the notion that the only right way to write Black women into history is to kind of wedge them into those places where white women dominated American politics. When you give that up and you actually turn to follow Black women to where they were, and then ask yourself, what were they doing? Well, I don't have to tell you, you wind up in church, among other places. And for a long time, because we didn't find Black women in important numbers in the major suffrage associations, in the major women's rights conventions in early America, some historians assumed that Black women weren't interested in that. So part of my job, right, is to follow Black women where they actually were. And they're in places like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. And there, sure enough, going back 200 years, right, Black women are talking about the problem of rights. They are working toward winning political power within their church communities. They are developing a political critique of that, what today we call intersectionality, right? The way in which racism and sexism are, pinning them in a very particular place in American political culture. So for me, it was essential to start with the church women because they are some of the really great and cutting edge thinkers. Even before we get to the chapters that are about activism, I wanted to make sure we understood better where, now I'll be honest, my students think they invented intersectionality. It turns out it's not really true. And that's okay, I tell them that. And we introduce them to, Kimberly Crenshaw so they can understand how that analysis enters academic conversations. But Black women have been talking intersectionality and working through the idea of intersectionality for 2 centuries. And the church women like Jarena Lee, who I write about in Philadelphia in the early decades of the 19th century, she wants a preaching license in a denomination that does not want to give women power. And she needs a critique. And her critique is the beginnings of intersectionality.
I think it's also interesting that there was a lot of objection to women doing preaching and being involved in political activity as far as race goes. But there was also a lot of objection from Black men in the church to women participating. Why?
By the time we get to the end of the 19th century and AME Church, the AME Zion Church, Black Baptist Church are all roiling with changes and with women who have long been doing, right, the work of raising funds and supporting ministers and filling the pews and more. Women who see the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of lynching, and feel called, right, not just spiritually, but politically, to be a part of the challenge to that turn, and they generate a debate as they try and move toward power. For example, they want to be ordained to the ministry. And the debate is an interesting one because on the one hand, you have Black men, leaders in Black Methodist churches, for example, who will say the best Black church, right? The ideal of the Black church is to reject all of the arbitrary man-made differences, right, that are imposed on human beings. That means we are a church that has long rejected racism and slavery. But perhaps we should also be a church that rejects sexism, because sexism is perhaps just as arbitrary as racism. Right, so the Black church should be leading, right, all of Christendom on these questions. That's one view. The other view is that Black churches are vulnerable, that they need to continue to prove their worthiness, right, within the world of Methodism writ large, which means that you don't want to stand out too much. You don't want to depart from too far from what white Methodists are doing. And if white Methodists aren't ordaining women, why on earth would we get out front? And so it really engenders an important battle over what is the true nature of a Black church? Why do we have a Black church if it isn't to embody a very specific and very forward-looking set of ideals? But not all men and not all women, frankly, agree about that question.
When we get into farther into the era of civil rights, there's often been a question about how much support was there for the civil rights movement from the Black churches. And for those who may not have studied the various periods in history, they may not realize that all Black churches weren't in favor of civil rights actions. Were you surprised when you learned that, or did you say, yeah, I knew that?
Well, I'll say that, you know, that sort of struggle within Black Christian communities goes all the way back to the early America and the abolitionist years, right? It is not a given that all Black church communities, not all Black sanctuaries, not all Black preachers welcome abolitionists, right? There is, you know, there is a philosophy, right? Perhaps a deeply flawed one, perhaps in the end, a proven flawed one, but this notion, right, that to keep your head low, right, to work below the radar is a way forward. And so, no, I guess is the short answer to your question, you know, that there is a great deal of diversity and difference and debate within Black churches. And that's what makes them so fascinating to study, because they really are a place to go where you can appreciate the range of ideas that Black folks are working through. And, you know, in church, it can get heated and fraught. I will not deny that for a moment. But nonetheless, we know that these are institutions that, yes, are spiritual sanctuaries, right, but are really at the heart of African-American public culture and politics going all the way back to the abolitionist era. And I think we could argue that remains true even today.
You also write about the use of journalism in telling the various stories of Black and white women and Black and white men. Since I'm a journalist, very often I'm asked, what's the need of the Black press? Why is that important? But you point out the reasons why the Black press was important all the way back to Freedom's Journal.
Freedom's Journal, the very first African-American owned and led newspaper in the US, begins publication in New York City in 1827. And here, Freedom's Journal is stitching together, you know, an increasing number of new free Black communities, certainly throughout the Northeast, New England, as far south as Baltimore, as far west as Detroit. How do folks become a political community? How do they debate ideas across this extraordinary expanse of terrain and this increasing expanse of terrain? The answer is Freedom's Journal. And one of the most fascinating things about Freedom's Journal is there on the masthead, you can see who the agents are and where they were. Which is to say, right, there are men, and they are mostly men, receiving the paper and distributing it in cities far, far away from New York. And we have this very vivid map then, right, of how that African-American public culture, political culture is coming into being. And newspapers are critical. Again, folks don't always agree on the pages of newspapers. That's what makes them fascinating. Yet Black women understand the power of the pen and the power of print from the beginning of the 19th century, and use newspapers, whether it's the ladies' column or it's the letters to the editor, or it's like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who in the 1850s will found her own newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. She will conceal for a bit that in fact she, as the editor, is a woman, because she understands how unorthodox that is. But she understands ultimately you can't imagine freedom, right? You can't imagine political transformation in the United States if you don't have access to print and to the newspaper in particular.
I like the title of your book, The Vanguard. How did you decide to call it that? Because I have an idea for a different title.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to know your title, but I'll tell you mine, and then you can tell me yours. Well, I'll say that I can't say exactly how I landed on it, except that there are a number of books on my shelf that use the word Vanguard in the title, including those that think about African-American history. So I lit on Vanguard very early, and I had to fight for it. I can say that now with a smile, because I won that fight with my publisher. But it really was, for me, it captured the argument of the book in a nutshell, right? That Black women had been founders from the earliest years of this country, that they had been the originator of what today we recognize as our best ideals, and that they had, through the pen, the podium and the pulpit and more, right, had been leading us to that intersectional, right, analysis, critique, vision of American politics. And I don't think we get to a moment such as that, which we find ourselves in 2021, with so many American women, importantly Black American women, in political power, if we don't understand that Black women have been leading us to this place for most of our history, sort of alone, right, without much in the ways of robust allies. So what's your title, Joanne?
Well, you just said the title. The title could be The Pen, the Pulpit, and the Podium,
yeah,
where women were forbidden to speak, but they did it anyway.
That is the truth. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it works, even as we come into the 21st century, where we have to contend with, I don't know, social media and things like that. I think the principle, right, this principle still stands. And I think it's hard. It was hard for my students. As I was working on this book, my students read some of the early drafts, and, some of our discussions were about their reckoning with, for the first time, that there, for a long time in this country, the notion that women would use the pen or the pulpit or the podium was profoundly controversial, and Black women really did have to break those barriers.
The students you're talking about, the ones who helped you with the book and the ones that you teach, where do they think women's involvement in politics began? Do they think it started with Kamala Harris? Or do they realize there were so many more women?
It might be Abrams. No, I'm kidding. My students, once I'm done with them, I think are well schooled. But it's true, right? That in some ways, when you know, it's back to your earlier question, right? Why didn't I know this? You know, in every generation, we have to teach and reteach, you know, that, you know, American history is vast, African-American history is vast. And so I'm not troubled, right, that I have to teach those lessons again and again. Because I think that what happens, right, when you begin to offer up, you know, women like those I offer up in Vanguard, you know, Ida Wells, Mary Church Terrell, you know, Mary McLeod Bethune, Shirley Chisholm, Polly Murray, students will find their way there. You know, that in fact, they do know more of this history than, and that hasn't all gelled for them, but they do know more of this history, even if it's only a part of it. You know, I ask them to interview an elder, right, in their own circle, right, to find out their stories about women and the vote in the United States or wherever in the world, right, their elders may have been. And that helps them, I think, to find their way into the story and to appreciate that it does have a history and it wasn't just an invention of the 2020 election cycle.
No, it goes a long way farther back than that. What are some of the elements that stand out when you were doing research for this book that you think made it a success? When did you find something you said, aha, this is going to be good?
I think one of the things that the questions that was sort of haunting the book, even though it wasn't my question, I knew it was a question that people have, which was, why hadn't Black and white women managed to more often, more robustly, or in a more sustained way, why hadn't Black and white women found some kind of sisterhood, right? A true alliance? Why hadn't they become accomplices? Why were they so long at odds? And, you know, there is a version of the answer, which is a blunt one, right? And it is slavery and racism. But I needed to be able to say more than that. And then I began to read the testimony, testimony after testimony, and testimony after testimony of Black women activists and the troubles that they encountered when they traveled. Traveling Black, as my colleague Mia Bay has put it in the title of her recent book, was a dangerous, fraught, and defining experience for Black women activists. They traveled to those conventions and those meetings and those protests in ways that were very different than their white counterparts. And when I recognized that nearly every woman I wrote about had a story about being harassed, denigrated, assaulted, sometimes brutally, when she tried to sit in a ladies' car or to take that first class seat that she had paid for, I realized not only that Black women were having a very distinct experience, but it meant that when they talked about women's rights, women's votes, yes, they talked about equality, but they also talked about dignity, and the dignity that they aimed to secure by way of winning the vote. And finally, that they tell us that white women witness again and again and again their denigration and do nothing. And that is a gulf, right? That is a divide, that is a rift that we might say we're still seeing made manifest on election day, right? When Black women vote as a bloc and use their power as women to move the needle on election day, and white American women do not, we recognize that I think those formative differences and distances are still being felt, I think, even in the 21st century.
There was a point in the book, and I can't quote it exactly. I could probably dig it out if I grabbed a book and found the right page. But you were talking about white women associating their condition because they couldn't vote until the 19th Amendment. They associated their condition with slavery, with being property that was owned by the men. The slavery of sex, they looked at it as, which seems sort of like you want to shake these women and say, no, don't you see that that's not the same thing?
I mean, this metaphor that some women's rights advocates, some women's suffrage advocates pick up and use, I think, rhetorically to some good effect, right? But they do so alongside and in the face of, and without fully having thought through that the Black women who are their peers, who might be their associates and more, slavery is not a metaphor, right? It's not an analogy. It is a lived experience. It is a family history. And certainly in early America, even free Black women in the North understand that their status, any possibility they have of being full citizens is wholly linked to the scourge of slavery. They can't disentangle themselves from that. And it again tells you something about the distance between Black and white women and how they're thinking through, right, the problem of what it means for women to insist upon rights.
Probably a lot of people don't realize that when the women were marching for the vote before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and they were doing all the marches in the white dresses with the purple sashes, particularly a big march in New York, there were Black women who were there too, but they had a different place in the march, didn't they?
Well, I think that undoubtedly, by the time we get to the 20th century and the important dynamic years that take us to 1920 and ratification of the 19th Amendment, part of what makes that dynamism possible is that suffrage leaders have admitted, have encouraged, have become complicit with anti-Black racism. And that means that Black women who are also suffragists are going to encounter, yes, slights, yes, marginalizations, challenges to their leadership and organizational styles, and more. It is not a hospitable, right, or simpatico political environment in which to be waging a serious struggle for women's rights. There's nothing foreordained about the 19th Amendment. So the answer is yes, right? That Black women will find themselves marginalized in public settings, marginalized at conventions, but most importantly, what they will come to know is that in the halls of Congress and in state legislatures, the prospect of their voting rights is being traded away in exchange for the 19th Amendment. That beyond the kind of slights and the, you know, and those kinds of things, is that there's a political bargain, right, being forged in the US. And it is the promise that if the 19th Amendment becomes law, if the states ratify that amendment, make it part of the Constitution, nothing in the amendment's terms will keep or prohibit those states that choose to, nothing will prohibit them from continuing to disenfranchise Black women. And that's the dirty open secret of the 19th Amendment. And no one who is in any way connected to suffrage politics is naive about that. Black, white, men, women, everybody knows that's the bargain that's being struck in those years.
in the years of the 60s and the 70s, when the civil rights activities were going on, and then the Democratic and the Republican conventions were going on, and into the 80s and 90s, Black women were still there making their voices heard, like Fannie Lou Hamer, which most of us have heard of, but I'm sure there are some people who do not know what Fannie Lou Hamer did when she went to the Democratic convention in Chicago.
Well, I'll say that stay tuned. There are 2 new biographies of Mrs. Hamer slated to come out. I think later this year, one from historian Keisha Blaine and the other from historian Kate Larson. So Mrs. Hamer is going to be on everyone's reading list very soon. But you're right to point out that appreciating or looking at the struggle for voting rights through the lens of Fannie Lou Hamer teaches us some new things about the movement. First of all, we learn about the extraordinary and the very specific price that Black women pay when they are on the front lines of the organizing, activism, and more in places like Mississippi, where Mrs. Hamer is at work by the early 1960s. Mrs. Hamer will lose her job, her livelihood. She will be assaulted, sexually assaulted at the hands of local police in an effort to humiliate and to suppress her activism. So we learned something about the price that Black women pay for being on the front lines of this activism in the civil rights revolution. And at the same time, Mrs. Hamer understands, I think, like very few others, her power to command not only a crowd, but a camera. And Mrs. Hamer is an eloquent wordsmith, but she is someone who knows how to ensure that she will be broadcast into not only, the working rooms of the White House or the back rooms of Congress, but into the living rooms of all Americans. And so part of what for me is so brilliant and remarkable about Mrs. Hamer is that she steps right into those spotlights and understands how to be sure that her claim, the claim for Black voting rights there in the 1960s, is one that cannot be ignored, right? As Americans across the country, right, turn on their televisions, for example, during the Democratic National Convention of 1964, and there is Mrs. Hamer live before the Credentials Committee decrying the Democrats for having seated an all-white delegation against the objections of Black Mississippians. And it is a powerful moment. I recommend, it's on YouTube. I really recommend it to folks. 8.5 minutes, just absolutely mesmerizing.
It is. I've listened to it, and it just so happened that I was in Chicago at the time of the convention. I didn't hear her live and in person, but I've heard it. I've heard the recording, and it is very moving. Yeah. What you also talk a little bit about one of my favorite women in politics, Barbara Jordan. Yes. We lost her far too soon. Yes. But she was a force to be reckoned with too, wasn't she?
Yes, so Barbara Jordan, Houston, Texas. Barbara Jordan, the first Black woman elected to Congress from the American South. Barbara Jordan, who I think it's fair to say, I don't know if you would agree, Jordan was a politician, which, she was a backroom, cut deals, politician. And, she's someone who not only does business with Lyndon Johnson, right, wins Johnson's respect and esteem. But when she gets to Congress, it is no ordinary season. And up front on the agenda is nothing less than the impeachment of Richard Nixon. and she will get that appointment to that committee and be there to open those inauguration proceedings in the House and give a speech that does not dance around the historical significance of her presence there in that moment, does not elide the fact that, as she puts it, right, the framers, the founders did not in any sense, right, imagine that Barbara Jordan would be in Congress. That might be enough, but be in Congress and responsible, right, for arbitrating, right, the conduct of the President of the United States in an impeachment proceeding. And so she was formidable in her actions. But again, this is so true of so many of the women in this book, is that when you give them the microphone or the pen, right, they give them the podium, they tell you what it means, right? They're not folks who are going to leave it to you to nuance your way or to, you know, figure it out for yourself. That these are women who are there to teach us about what American democracy can be, should be, must be. And when they get the microphone, that's what we hear. And it's and Barbara Jordan is remarkable.
Well, among other things, sexism, racism, which have been barriers for Black women in politics, but maybe also what you were just saying there. People realize that when Black women speak, we pull no punches.
Mhm.
We usually say truth to power. And that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable.
There's a lot that is uncomfortable in this book, and more, right? I mean, it engenders, right? It engenders retaliation, you know, retribution, violence. It is not an easy burden to bear, I don't think, to spend 2 centuries holding this country, right, to its best ideals, right? That is, if not thankless, right, it is a risky and unenviable position, I would say. And yet, thank goodness, right? Thank goodness that there are Black women who do not shy away from the necessity of, as you put it, speaking truth to power. And you know, one of the words in this book that came to me from the women in it was the word humanity. Right? That these are women who understood their purpose, understood their strivings for power as serving the interests of humanity. And I think because they are Black women, people don't fully see, right, that ambition and that vision. I always, you know, the example of Leader Stacey Abrams. You know, Leader Abrams, when she moved to Fair Fight after, frankly, having the election stolen from her in Georgia by way of voter suppression, you know, Leader Abrams pivoted and began to organize. And she didn't organize for the voting rights of Black women, though she was in part doing that. She didn't organize simply for the voting rights of Black Americans, though she certainly was doing that, right? She was voting rights for all Americans, right? I mean, and she's very deliberate about that. It's, I think, too often, unfortunately, that ambition, that vision, that kind of commitment to all of humanity, as you know, the women of the 19th century would have put it, gets overlooked and elided.
Well, I would think that people in America should appreciate that the struggles that Black women and Black men, but Black women as part of the Vanguard, have gone through and are still going through, benefit not only them, but the larger society. Like the women's rights movement benefited from the civil rights movement. but I think it's kind of hard for people to say, we're able to do this now because those Black women did that then.
Yeah. And I think, it goes back in some ways to where we started this conversation, which is the need for a kind of political education that not all of us have had the opportunity to secure, right? So, I'm an educator, right? And sort of, my deep agenda, right, is teaching, is giving us all, right, a new set of tools, a new set of understandings, so that we can connect those dots in American politics, to help my students, whatever their own identities might be, to appreciate that when they themselves invoke intersectionality, they are indebted, right, to Black women thinkers and Black women activists. That is part of, that's part of what I hope a book like Vanguard makes possible for many of us, is connecting those dots.
Well, I'm going to ask some of the people who are watching us today to submit a question or two, because we do have enough time for maybe 3 questions.
Okay.
So put them in the chat and I will relay them to Martha, and she can respond to them before they start coming in. What do you think? What do you think you want your major takeaway to be from this book? And where do you think this book should be read besides by all of us? Should this be in middle schools or high schools or colleges, or?
I really hope that, it certainly makes its way to high school students. I'm very encouraged about that, because some of the best stories, or the most moving stories that people share with me, is when you get your copy of Vanguard and your mother snatches it from you. I have a friend who told me she was on her porch, it was COVID, right? So she's on her porch with her mother, and the book arrived, she opened it, and her mom said, "Thank you," and she snatched it and went home. And so I'm still waiting to read it because my mom has got it. But I thought, so if I've got a book, right, that mom will reach for. And then another friend who told me she was listening to it on audiobook in the car with her teenage son. And when they got home, as we kind of do if we're listening to a book in the car, you kind of sit in the driveway to get to a pause. And he said to her, let's sit and hear the rest of the chapter. And I thought, okay, right, that I can't imagine, for me, a more important tribute really to the women, to their stories, and to the necessity of those stories than that. I talked to lots of audiences, lots of educators who are trying to figure for themselves how to incorporate this history into their, very crowded lesson plans and all the demands that they have. And I think that is such important work to me. Not that you have to assign the book, though my publisher might quibble.
Yes.
But not that you've designed the book, but to find a way, right, to incorporate some part of the book, right, that makes sense for what you're teaching. And while I know folks don't always want to read the endnotes, right? That's not the most scintillating part of the book. The endnotes are there to point, it's a map, right? For folks who want to develop lessons and want to do further teaching. It can show you to other secondary writing articles and books on many of the women in Vanguard, but it can also show you to primary materials, their speeches, their writings. Much of them are publicly available in open access. And so I wanted people to be able to use the endnotes so that they could reinvent the book for themselves and use the parts that make sense for their purpose. Of course, I want people to read the book, but I want it to do work in the world. And I know sometimes that means that you take parts of it and you leave other parts for another time. And I think that's okay too.
Yeah. Yes, there are a lot of endnotes. I was looking through those as I was going through the chapters and saying, boy, she's done a lot of research in it.
You know why I don't design monuments, because I could never fit my ideas onto like an 8x8, granite plinth. It's just not what I do. But
Yeah. We have a question here. How do scholars get the attention of those who make decisions about textbooks and reading lists?
absolutely. So part of my work is to work with K through 12 educators, yes, but to work with those organizations. One of my favorites is the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History. Those kinds of organizations, my professional organizations like the Organization of American Historians, who are sort of deep in the politics of this kind of rethinking of what's in our textbooks. That's a long-term project. It's to say to turn the direction of textbooks is long term, but I think it's worth it, and part of my job is to help people figure out not how you change the whole textbook, though I love that. And my colleagues, Diana Ramey Berry and Kylie Gross, have just published a new kind of thorough history of Black women in the United States that functions like a textbook and can be taught that way. And so those books are out there too. But oftentimes it's just to help people, change the story of, say, like Seneca Falls, where there were no Black women, and learn how to tell that story differently so that Black women and where they were is better accounted for.
We have another question in the chat about Black women's sororities and the importance of their organizations in the political voice of the United States.
Thank you so much for that.
Specifically one sorority, and I'm not going to point it out because then all the other sororities will get mad.
Absolutely. No, we're just going to say Divine Nine and leave it at that. But there's no question, right, that Black women's sororities by the early 20th century are going to be key sites, again, for the development of critical ideas about women in politics, and then places where Black women are going to organize out and through. Two small examples, it is Black women's sorority members who in 1913 turn out from Howard University to Alice Paul's Women's Parade. There was a profound ambivalence among those organizers about the presence of Black women. They are afraid to be discouraging or turning off, right, Southern suffragists. But those young women from Howard are there, and they're there in force with their advisor, Mary Church Terrell. And then fast forward to the 21st century, and not so long ago, the confirmation hearings for Loretta Lynch, when Loretta Lynch was proposed to be the next Attorney General of the United States. And while I won't say the color, I'll just say that the women of her sorority were there in full force. And if folks didn't understand what it meant, the senators, that is, as they looked out on a sea of red, and yes, it was red, they didn't understand that. Well, a lot of us did, and it was a beautiful piece of political theater that let lawmakers know that Black women were organized behind this candidate, that they were tuned in, and they were going to hold the Senate accountable for the fate of Loretta Lynch.
Another question from one of our participants is, which woman you wrote about is the biggest inspiration to you?
That's a hard one. But one of the things I think Joanne knows is that this book begins with a very personal essay about the women in my own family. And so I don't think there's any answer I could possibly give than to say my own grandmother and great-grandmother, who in their lives in St. Louis in Missouri and Greensboro, North Carolina, are Black women suffragists and voting rights advocates who work right, in community with other Black women. My great-grandmother at the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA in St. Louis, my grandmother at Bennett College in Greensboro. I work in an office where their portraits sit right over my shoulder, and I'm not only accountable to them, I'm very inspired by them, and I felt very fortunate to learn a little bit more about their lives than I had known before through writing this book.
Do you think, Martha, do you think if people watching us tonight look back in their own family history, they're going to find active women that will surprise them?
Absolutely, you know, and I hoped that by kind of taking a plunge into my own family history for the first time on these questions, I might inspire other people to do the same. Because it turns out, right, that the stories of our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers and our aunties and more, that is US history, right? That is what the fabric of a book like Vanguard. And so we need to know those stories for ourselves, but we need to write them down, people, and make sure that they are preserved so that they can make their ways into books like mine, but into textbooks, and that they can be passed down in your own family, in your own community. So I really, you know, I missed the opportunity to ask those questions when my foremothers were here. I had to go and discover them in the archives. But if there's somebody whose story you don't know, it's a wonderful moment to begin to ask those questions. So take out your phone and record an interview and make sure that we have those stories so that we can continue to write these histories. I have hardly written an exhaustive history of Black women's politics or Black women's struggles around voting rights. And so there's a great deal more for us still to learn, to know, and to write down.
What do you want to be the major takeaway from your book? What do you want people, when they finish it and put it down, what do you want them to say to themselves that they have learned or will keep with them from reading Vanguard?
I want them to know that the women in our own midst in the 21st century, Leader Stacey Abrams, Vice President Kamala Harris, Mrs. Michelle Obama, St. Louis's Cori Bush, you know, who these Black women in our own time have not dropped from nowhere, are not unicorns, they're not mythical beings. They are women who come out of a very distinct and discernible and important American political tradition. And the reason Black women are such a force in the 21st century is that they've been doing this for a very long time. And you're seeing the accumulation of the struggle and disappointments, but also the experience and the savvy. And that is now manifest, whether it's at the polls on election day, or among the organizers who get people to the polls, or the 130 Black women who ran for Congress in 2020, or the 6 Black women who were on Joe Biden's shortlist. Black women are a force, and that's not new. But I hope people, after they read Vanguard, appreciate sort of how we got here.
I think that's important, to appreciate how we got here and to use that knowledge that you brought to so many people who didn't know it, so that they can move forward and continue to make progress in politics at all levels, with the pen and in the pulpit and at the podium.
Bravo.
I think we only have one question, which deals with having your book adapted for young audiences, but I don't know if you can really speak to that. Is your publisher planning on doing that?
I don't think so, but I will recommend Yvette Dionne's book, Lifting as We Climb, which is a wonderful young adult companion to Vanguard. And I've been very privileged to have the opportunity to talk with Yvette Dionne and to appreciate the ways in which our books are very much in conversation and just thinking about slightly different audiences. So I hope folks will keep an eye out for that too.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you, Martha. I
Thank you
hope the people who are listening have enjoyed it as much as I have.
It's really been an honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks to
Daniel,
Boswell Books.
Boswell Books, thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I think we can, both Sydney and I can say, and she'll say it also, that we were honored to have you and we're just blown away by the wonderful conversation. So, and I'll just say, as a bookseller, I know how you can get that as a YA, a young adult adaptation, is to sell and sell and sell. And so everybody here has to make sure they tell everybody about the book, and not only buy their own copy, but buy one for somebody else too. That'll help.
Thank you, both of you, so much. That was a great discussion. I'm so thankful and honored to be included with you all. And I hope that it does sell and sell and sell and buy more copies for your friends so that we can get a YA adaptation. I think it's very, very necessary.
Thanks to you, Sydney, and everybody at the museum.
Thank you both. Thank you, Sydney. Thanks to everyone for coming. We wouldn't have a virtual museum, soon to be not virtual, and bookstore, which has a little tiny bit of browsing, without you. Best of success, continued success to you. Looking forward to the documentary, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.